Today I'm going to talk about how I draw the female figure. And there were any number of things that I could have talked about in this video, but I chose to focus on the things that I personally like to focus on every time I'm drawing a woman as opposed to a man. Emphasis on personally, as this is just the way that I like to do it, and you may choose to emphasize different aspects of the female figure than me, and that's totally cool. So with that out of the way, this is how I draw the female figure. So before I get into any specifics, I first want to focus on some of the basic proportions between the male and female figure, and this isn't really any different from the information that you can already find online and even in other videos on the subject here on YouTube. It's the pretty common knowledge stuff, and it's that typically a man will have broader shoulders and their hips of course will be a lot narrower than their female counterpart. And that's like the surface level stuff, right? Everybody kind of already knows that. But to get more specific, one observation that I made when studying for this video is that if you take these 2 points at the widest part of the chest where it meets the deltoid and draw a line connecting the two, this distance is going to determine roughly how wide a man's hips can possibly go. In other words, if we draw 2 lines coming down from those points, the hips of a man will either be the same width or smaller. In this case, the figure's hips are smaller than that width, which is generally the case for the average man, and notice how the entire body fits within that measurement. Whereas with a woman, if I take the same 2 points on the chest and connect them, I found that the female's hips will either be the same width or bigger than that of the width of the chest. So notice how the legs on this particular figure sit outside of that distance as compared to a man whose body sits within that distance. And with this figure here, the width of the hips are about the same as that of the chest, and if we increase the width of the hips so that they sit outside of that distance, you'll find that they'll still look okay proportionally to the rest of the body as they were before. And real quick with a man, like we said before, a man's hips generally will either be the same width or smaller, so right now they're smaller, but if we increase the size of the hips to be about the same width as that of the chest, you'll see that it'll still look like the build of a man, albeit a much larger man this time. So to break it down to simple graphic shapes, this is essentially the typical shape language of a woman's figure versus that of a man, and it's basically the same shape but flipped upside down, vice versa. Another thing that I personally take note of is just that I find that the exterior oblique / lat part of a man's body is typically wider and more developed than a woman. And whenever I'm drawing a woman, I find that depending on the size of the breasts, that they'll just obscure most of what you'd normally be able to see anyway. And so I just like to imagine that I'm drawing the contour of the rib cage on a woman and place this section for the external oblique / lat on top of that shape. So normally this would be the external oblique / lat area, but it's still pretty much the rib cage that I'm describing there whenever I'm drawing a woman. So those are kind of just 2 things about the basic proportions between a man and a woman that I take into account, but the main thing that I like to focus on when I'm drawing women is the hips, because I feel like apart from obviously a woman's breasts, the hips of a woman is the most noticeable difference between a male and female figure. So for a man, I find that the common gesture of the hips is pretty much just straight up and down. There's no real rhythm to them. They're kind of just very boxy simply because a man's pelvis obviously isn't as wide as a woman's. So a man's hips will be narrow like this and lack any real curve to them. With women on the other hand, and again this is pretty common knowledge, very 1 + 1 = 2, and that's that a woman's hips will tend to come out at more of an angle than a man's. So again, that's kind of the obvious stuff, but for me, what always tripped me up for some reason was where the widest part of women's hips were. Is it like down here at the thigh, or is it up here near the top of the pelvis? And I found that the widest part of the hips is going to fall at about this level right at the very bottom of the crotch, which uncoincidentally is about the same level that the greater trochanter is also located, which is essentially the very top of your thigh bone, which is the femur. So when I draw the lines for the hips, as soon as I reach that level, that will determine the widest point of the hips, and from that level, the leg will start to curve inwards towards the knee. So even when drawing women from the back, I always know that the bottom of the hips will stop at about the same level as the crotch, and that helps me determine how wide to go when I'm drawing those hips. So in this 3/4 view, I find first the bottom of the crotch, which is this right here, and if I extend a line at the same level, as soon as I hit that level, I stop, and it then becomes the leg. So what I'm imagining in my head whenever I'm doing this is imagining this 3D isosceles trapezoid shape that represents the hips, and the bottom of this shape lines up to the bottom of the hips on the figure. So essentially this point is the same as this point, and this point here at the bottom is the same as this point. So if I just took this shape and moved it under the figure, you'll see that the corners of that shape will line up almost exactly to the corners of the hips on the actual figure. And that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm finding that level on the crotch. I'm basically describing the bottom of that shape. So when it comes to applying this when I'm drawing women in action poses, whenever I get to this point in the drawing where I'm missing the hips, I just imagine in my head where that level is at the bottom of the crotch to determine the bottom of the hips. And as far as how wide you can go with the hips, I feel like that's just completely up to your discretion. But for me, what's important is just to know where the bottom of the hips is in relation to the rest of the figure so that it doesn't look wonky or disproportionate. So with this figure, I went just a tad wider with the hips, but again, all I want to know is where the bottom of the hips will fall. So I draw a line from the bottom of the crotch to the hip to see if it lines up, and if it does, like it does here, that will tell me that this point here is the widest point of the hips before they curve down towards the knee. And that's pretty much all of the stuff that I focus on when it comes to at least finding the widest point of the hips. And again, no matter the angle I'm drawing the hips in, I always imagine this isosceles trapezoid shape, which helps me visualize the shape the hips will take whenever I'm drawing the hips in different angles like this, and it's always the same shape. So here I have the upper body, and I just put that shape in at the bottom, always remembering to include that plane change, which is this corner here. And if I just draw right on top of this shape, it actually gives me the shape of the hips. So this actually leads me to the last thing that I want to talk about in this video, which are hip dips, which are the slight indentations of the outer hips just above the thighs. Now, men can have hip dips too, but I find that they're just not really as noticeable as a woman's, simply because a woman's hips are just wider at the top, which makes the dent in the middle of the hips that much more prominent in women, especially because women also tend to collect more fat in the thighs at the bottom of the hips than men, which makes that dent all the more noticeable. I personally love drawing hip dips because it's just a rhythm that's so unique to women and really emphasizes the biggest difference in the natural proportions of a woman's body as opposed to a man's, which are the wider hips. So here we have a female figure, and this area here of course is where the hip dips are located, again just above the thigh, and it creates this out and in rhythm that also just brings forth the natural curvature of a woman's body when compared to a man whose hips generally lack a rhythm. And sometimes I like to imagine the hip dips as though they were like this triangular wedge that sits right on top of the thighs. Now, something I see typically done in drawings of hips is that people will tend to draw them with one single C-curve like this, which, to be clear, this isn't wrong necessarily, and in fact it's a very common cartoonization of curvy hips. So this becomes more of a personal preference, but I always like to just play with the angles of the hips, because I feel like it really accentuates what you typically associate with female figures. Because you have to remember that when you're drawing the hips, what's actually happening here with this very crude drawing of a pelvis, that the hips aren't shrink wrapped to the edges of the pelvis like this. They're going to drop down from the top of the pelvis, and what you have to remember too is that the greater trochanter, like we spoke about earlier, is what the lower hip wraps around as it goes into the leg, which is what makes the lower hip so wide. So it'll come in, which is the dent, then out as it goes around the greater trochanter, then in again as it goes down and becomes the thigh. And this creates the out and in rhythm of the hip dip. So again, typically it'll come out off the top of the pelvis, then back in, which is the dent of the hip dip, and then out again as it wraps around the greater trochanter, and then back in as it goes towards the knee. So no matter how wide or narrow you go with the hips, just bearing in mind the actual pelvis of your character will help you imagine how the hips wrap around that shape, giving you a unique rhythm to your character's hips. And as you saw here, even in plus-size women, that rhythm can still be seen in the hips, if only slightly less angular due to the fullness of the figure. And it can become even more pronounced in some cases with a plus-size woman if she's in a pose that naturally is pushing the hip out, making the rhythm more apparent. And with that, that's going to do it for today's video on how I draw the female figure. There are, of course, other aspects to drawing women that I didn't mention in this video, like of course, women's breasts, but I felt like that subject could be its own video entirely, so I decided just to focus on the hips and basic proportions with this one. As always, I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons for their support on Patreon this month, and of course, I'd like to thank you for watching today's video, and I'll see you on the next one.